Now that we've talked about inorganic compounds, those that do not contain carbon, such as water and acids and bases, and how they impact us as living things, we're going to flip the script and deal with the other aspect of compounds, that being the organic group, those that do contain carbon. A couple of background terms here that are going to be really important in understanding the idea of organic compounds would be the terms monomer and polymer. As it says here on the screen, you can see monomer is just the basic unit of something, and polymer then would be two or more of those monomers put together. It is through this sort of form or format that organic compounds are created. They each have a basic unit, and then to make larger versions of themselves, they take a bunch of those basic units and put them together. I know that doesn't make a whole lot of sense yet, but let me give an example or an analogy. Think about a brick wall. What is the smallest version of a brick wall? Well, it's one brick. In other words, that one brick is the monomer. It is the basic unit. And you can make brick walls of any size. A brick wall could be one brick. It could be two. It could be 200. It could be 20,000. You just keep adding more basic units, more monomers, and the polymer, the larger version, gets bigger and bigger with all those monomers being added. Carbs, carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, nucleic acids, they are all examples of organic compounds that compose living things. And they work in that format, or they are put together in that format that there are small versions of them, the monomer basic unit, and then as you create larger and larger ones, you put a bunch of those monomers together. We also, as background information, need to deal with the idea that there are four elements that show up in organic compounds way more than anything else. They show up a lot. Obviously, one of those would be carbon, since that is the defining quality of an organic compound. We also need to understand that those four elements that you see listed here, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen, which show up so frequently, each have a specific number of chemical bonds that they form with other atoms around them. And so the one that is represented here right in the middle would be the carbon with its four covalent chemical bonds that form around it with other things. What I did not represent would be the oxygen, which forms two bonds, the nitrogen, which forms three bonds with other atoms, and the hydrogen, which only forms one. What we're going to do is to go into each of those four different groups of organic compounds that compose us in some detail. And so we're going to start with the carbohydrates. And the thing that you always want to keep in mind about carbs is that their main function, although they have other functions, their main function is that carbohydrates provide living things with a source of energy. Now, go back to that idea of monomers and polymers for a second, and we're going to describe and picture here the smallest, the monomer version of a carbohydrate, and we call it a monosaccharide. So a monosaccharide is the monomer. It is the smallest version of a carbohydrate, just like one brick would be the smallest version of a brick wall. And you're seeing three examples here, and I'm assuming that probably at least two of them are kind of familiar to you. Glucose, galactose, and fructose are three different monosaccharides. They are the smallest version of a carbohydrate. You'll notice that on the bottom I have the chemical formula listed for each one of those, and strangely, I guess, they all happen to be C6H12O6. Well, how's that possible? How can three different monosaccharides have the same chemical formula? Well, you can probably guess that although they have the same parts, those parts are not put together in the exact same way, and therefore they are slightly different versions of each other. But they are all monosaccharides. The other term that you probably want to jot down here for monosaccharide is that it is also known as a simple sugar. These are all sugars. They're all sweet. They just have slightly different chemical combinations. If we want to make a slightly larger carbohydrate, we would have a disaccharide. Di, prefix, simply means two. So if you take two monosaccharides and chemically link them together, you have a disaccharide. And again, I think some of these are probably pretty familiar to you. Sucrose, which is simply table sugar, is just a glucose molecule chemically combined to a fructose. So two monosaccharides together make a disaccharide. Lactose, which you're familiar from milk, is glucose and galactose joined together. And maybe one that you're not as familiar with, maltose, is just two glucoses. Now again, these are sugars. They're just not as simple as the monosaccharides. So monosaccharides are simple sugars. These are just sugars. If we want to get even bigger still, our third category of carbohydrates is called polysaccharides. And so those, if you have 3 monosaccharides or 3,000 monosaccharides all linked chemically together, you have what is called a polysaccharide. I imagine you're familiar with the term starch, maybe not as much with glycogen, and then probably not at all with cellulose, but those are all just a whole big long chain of polysaccharides all put together. We mentioned earlier that carbs are our source of energy. And so when plants store their carbs, they store them as starch. So for instance, a potato. You access a potato, you open it up, that is just filled with starch, and that was the storage facility for that plant in storing its carbohydrates that it would use later for energy. Animals do the same thing. We store our carbohydrates. We just store them in something different form called glycogen. And you might be familiar with cellulose as making up the cell walls of plants, but perhaps not. If we take those three and look at pictures of them, you can see what I mean by big long chains. So you're looking there at a whole bunch of monosaccharides. For instance, right there is one, right there is another, and another, all linked in these big long branching chains, and that represents a polysaccharide. Something that is important to affiliate with this idea of carbs, as it will be with some other organic molecules as well, are a set of chemical reactions, some opposite chemical reactions. The first being dehydration synthesis. You will look at the example here and you will see some of the things that we were just talking about. You can see here's a glucose, in other words there is a monosaccharide. Here too, another glucose, a monosaccharide. Well, how would you take two monosaccharides and join them together, as I described earlier, to form a disaccharide? Well, you would do so through dehydration synthesis. I'll throw in there that it's also known as a condensation reaction. And when you hear those two terms, hopefully what you're thinking of is water. When you hear the word condensation or you hear the word dehydration, I would assume water comes to mind. Well, look at the diagram here. Here's our one glucose, and here highlighted is an O with an H. There's a hydroxide. Here's another hydroxide on this glucose, but you'll notice just the H is highlighted. Hey, H, H, O, you have the ingredients for water. And so those three, H, H, O, all form a water molecule. How does that help? Well, right here is a chemical bond that did exist when that O and H were attached to this glucose. But those O and H's are now gone. And so there is a chemical bond available there. Here's an O, and it was attached to this H. And remember, O's require 4 chemical bonds. Once that H becomes part of this water molecule, this O needs to satisfy that second chemical bond. And so if we look over here, this O is this O. And so that O now satisfied its second bond by joining onto this molecule here, and therefore two glucoses have now been chemically linked together through dehydration synthesis to make maltose, a disaccharide. We can look at the exact same type of thing down here. We have a glucose and a fructose instead, but the exact same thing is occurring. O, H, H are removed to form a water molecule. That frees up chemical bonds that need to be formed again. And so here again, that O is that O, and it joins on to the glucose molecule over here, and a glucose and a fructose have now combined to make sucrose. And if you do that a whole bunch more times, instead of taking monosaccharides and making disaccharides, you'll just make polysaccharides by forming ever-increasing longer links like you saw before. The opposite of dehydration synthesis is a reaction called hydrolysis. If you can take small pieces and link them together to make larger, as we just described, your body also has the ability to do just the opposite and take larger things and break them down to make them small again. And so here you're looking at a disaccharide. If you take those two H's and an O and add them back in instead of removing them, there's the O, there's one of the H's, there's the other. You will instead break something apart. You will break organic compounds down. So dehydration synthesis puts things together and makes larger molecules. Hydrolysis takes larger molecules and breaks them apart into smaller pieces. That's a concept that's going to come back again and again as you learn about other organic compounds, such as lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids.